Welcome to the Resolution Room, a monthly podcast on behalf of Mediation Northern Ireland at Ulster University, where we explore the uses of mediation in conflict resolution and in peace building. This episode, the seventh in the series, is on trauma-informed mediation. I'm Mike Gaston, and today I'm joined by conflict response specialist Sara Cook, and we're going to explore trauma in conflict and in conflict resolution, resilience in mediation, and how we might set about enabling the development of resilience in conflict resolution. Sara, you're so welcome here today. It's lovely to catch up with you, and I'm really looking forward to what we're doing today. Let's start at the beginning. How did you get involved in mediation?
Well, it's great to be here with you today, Mike. Thanks so much for hosting this conversation. Like most peace builders and many, many mediators, I sort of stumbled into the profession. So I think so many of us would say we sort of accidentally became peace builders. And that certainly has been the case for me. I came to Northern Ireland in 2001. I was a student actually in 1997, so right before the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So I was here for about 3 months, living in Derry, living on the water side with a woman who worked for the police and living in a very loyalist housing estate there. And then, of course, studying and socializing on the city side in Derry. So a really interesting start to my experience of Northern Ireland, but was just here for 3 months, never thought I'd be back. And through a whole kind of series of events, I ended up coming back in 2001 to do a couple of years of voluntary service here. And the idea was just to kind of contribute to the support of organizations working with people after the conflict and investing in cross-community work, peace building. And I was offered a job. So my intention was never to stay. I was just going to come for a year or two, volunteer, and then be back on my merry way back to the US and back in the career rat race. But was offered a really interesting role running an organization that worked with dialogue and storytelling as a means to address some of the psychosocial impact of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And we were really one of the first projects to bring former British soldiers back to Northern Ireland. So it was a Derry-based project, and we were really honoring the requests of families in Derry who had often been affected quite deeply by state violence, and who wanted to really have a conversation, a dialogue for their own healing purposes with people who had been involved with the British Army. So fascinatingly, our project began to grow quite quickly, and we had involved, of course, former British soldiers, also former police, former prison officers, their families, Republicans and loyalists and their families, and people who had been injured or bereaved by state violence or paramilitary violence. So very diverse groups, very, very complex sharing of stories and lived experience, very complex dialogue. But what was really inspiring about that is, you'd think that might be quite heavy work, but it was actually really uplifting. So you were seeing the best of humanity in those spaces, people sitting down, listening to each other's perspectives that, society would never expect to be in those spaces. So that was really profound, very, very moving. But what I also took away from that work was this really strong awareness of the way that trauma was impacting people. So people were doing this incredibly courageous peace building work. Some people were on their own healing journeys, either with therapy or other things. So people were figuring things out at the head level and the heart level, but the body was still keeping the score. So people were noticing that they couldn't sleep, or that they couldn't eat, or they were struggling to leave their homes, or they were really having trouble with flashbacks or nightmares, having disruption of their relationships. And as a practitioner, my first thought was, how do we get tools into the hands of individuals and communities who are already doing this amazing work, but maybe need help with this kind of addressing of the psychosocial impact of conflict or the trauma that comes from conflict? And that's led me to do a lot of the work I do today.
Amazing start to a great career, Sara. And what I'm thinking is, how does a young practitioner develop the maturity and the skills to work in such a complex process? You need to say a little bit about that.
It's a really interesting question. I was very young when I came here. So my first job out of uni was as the executive director of a residential facility for young mothers experiencing homelessness in the States. So working with young women between the ages of 14 and 22 who found themselves pregnant, but also struggling to find a safe place to live, which at that point was kind of a uniquely American problem that you would experience homelessness in those circumstances. And so that was, quite a testing ground. I worked 80 hours a week for 2 years and engaged with huge amounts of traumatized individuals. And so I think it matured me quite quickly. I was always a bit of an old soul anyway, but that work really, gave me a lot of insight into the world, into the suffering that people often carry with them. And so when I came to Northern Ireland, I think I came with, certainly a respect for what people have gone through here, a curiosity about how the peace process would continue to develop after the Good Friday Agreement, but also with probably quite a deep understanding for someone at the age of 24, in terms of trauma and what that looks like.
Amazing. You describe yourself as an old soul. Where did that come from?
Well, I mean, this is kind of maybe a sort of a side conversation, but my father is a minister. He's a minister of religion, a pastor in the U.S., and so I grew up as a pastor's kid in these really big churches. And so I had to be a little bit of a natural diplomat. I, engaged with a lot of different types of people, a lot of different politics, and figuring out how, all of those things fit together in this kind of community of people. And so I think that probably contributed to me, really being curious about people, really enjoying interactions with a lot of different types of people, and also maybe a levity in terms of knowing, life can take a lot of strange turns, and it's important for people to hold space for each other. And so I think that probably informed a lot of what came after for me in terms of my work.
And, it's fascinating. We could go down this rabbit hole into infinity about where our drive for peace building, for mediation comes from. Mm-hmm. But I guess I'm going to switch up a little bit now and say, what impact has that process had on your life, your career, and your non-work life? What impact has that had?
It's a really good question. So my work, when I came to Northern Ireland, was very formative. The 2 years of voluntary work was really interesting. I worked in Ballysally, which is a primarily loyalist housing estate in Coleraine. And then my second year was with the Peace and Reconciliation Group in Derry. And so that gave me a really good and broad understanding of again, that lived experience of life in Northern Ireland at that time, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And then my work facilitating storytelling and dialogue processes, designing them, implementing them, running this organization was really, I suppose, quite formative in what came after. So all of my work after that, throughout my career, has been in peace building, it's been in mediation, but for a long time just in Northern Ireland. So most of my work was here. But when my kids came along, on the personal level, I found it really hard to be a part-time peace builder. So I tried that for about 2 years and realized I was getting paid part-time, but I was often working between 40 and 60 hours a week. So I decided to work for myself at that stage. And at that point, I ended up getting invited to do a lot of work internationally, bringing learning from our experience here in Northern Ireland. And so a lot of my work over the last 8 years is really centered on international communities affected by conflict. So I've done a lot of work in Ukraine since the start of the invasion there, done quite a bit of work in Afghanistan, in the Syrian context, in Myanmar, and really with people from over 50 countries around the world. And so that, I think that those early years have really informed this, I suppose, broadening of the areas where I practice. And that's been really fulfilling for me and meaningful for me personally, because as we know, the world is in such flux. It's such a difficult time. And there's so little a lot of us can do about those things. We would change so many things if we could. We can't. But what's been helpful for me is being able to do what I can to support people's peace building work in those areas, to support humanitarian work, to support people's psychosocial well-being, either communities who have been impacted directly by conflict, by natural disaster, etc., but also the practitioners in those spaces. And we might talk about this later in our conversation, but practitioners often carry a hugely heavy burden that are working in these contexts. And the culture of our sectors, both peace building and humanitarian work, have not always acknowledged that. So we haven't always made space to say, what's the impact on the individuals working in these spaces? So it's brought me huge joy to do all of that, to kind of work in some of those supportive spaces over the last 8 years in particular. And it's also been great, you ask about personal life or home life. It's been great from the standpoint of my kids, because they get to see what this is like to, invest in the world around you and to make choices that allow you to, to try to make change in maybe small but important ways. And so as a mom, that's been great to have them engage with that and ask questions and I suppose support me in the work that I'm doing.
You've talked about three very difficult conflicts, the three that you picked out. So Myanmar, which not many of us know a lot about, Afghanistan, which some of us know a little about, but not enough, and Ukraine, which has been very headline for a long time now. How do you manage to balance that against the family life you've described? Because you're carrying a lot from those conflicts.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in our conversation, but I think some of it for me is helping balance the trauma-informed work with the resiliency-informed, the resiliency-focused work. So a question that one of my mentors shared with me a number of years ago, Elaine Miller-Karras, who's created a really interesting model called the community resiliency model, which I use a lot in my work. Elaine kind of asked this question of what else is true. Okay, so we know that trauma is true. We don't want to pretend it's not there. But what are all those other factors in our lives that we often lose sight of when we're overwhelmed by the adversity that we experience or that we carry? So it's about kind of asking ourselves that question, what else is true? Who are the people that are supporting me? What are the things that are really good in life right now? And I've had to do that myself, especially when the work becomes intense, acknowledging how hard that can be to witness some of these things, to walk alongside of people when they're experiencing these hugely difficult human experiences. But also reminding myself what else is true, going to the beach with the kids and walking in the sand and, listening to great music. And I love reading. So, sitting down at the end of the day and giving myself time to read and things like that have really helped me hold some of the more difficult work and tension, but also hearing people from those regions, their experience of resilience. So asking them, what helps you feel stronger? What helps you keep going? What are the things in your life that bring you joy? And that's remarkable because, of course, people can talk about the suffering, and they do. But when you ask someone, what's a really important part of your life that keeps you going through all this, the responses are remarkable. And it's so joyful to hear people share those things. I get that experience of vicarious resilience. So we talk about vicarious trauma, but vicarious resilience is true. We just don't look for it. And so that's a big practice for me in my work, is making space for myself, but also the people I work with, to name those things, to celebrate those things, and to bring them into the conversation.
You've excited me about the rest of this conversation. I'm just going to hold you to one additional point, though, before we move on to look at trauma-informed mediation. And what I want to do with you is just to ask you to pick one example of something that stayed with you in the work that you've done anywhere in the world.
Yeah. Well, a story that sits with me so often these days is a conversation that I had with a man after the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. So I traveled to the border on the Turkish side and met with humanitarian workers who not only were affected by the earthquakes themselves, many had lost significant numbers of their family or had been injured, but their job actually was as humanitarian workers. So their work was to support others who had been affected by the earthquakes. So a huge amount of kind of primary and secondary trauma amongst that group. And one of the things that I explained when I was sharing a little bit about trauma with the group was that, when we're in an emergency situation, when our body perceives us to be under threat, the brain, the survival brain, which is the unconscious part of our brain, manages all of our unconscious functions. That's what chooses our survival response, whatever it thinks we need in that moment to survive. And this man came up to me after I explained this at the break, and he said, "Thank you so much for sharing that, because actually when the earthquake happened, I leapt up from my bed and I ran out of my apartment, and I didn't wake my wife, and I didn't grab my children." And he said, "I've lost family members, and I've been deeply personally impacted by this earthquake, but this was the thing that really has affected me the most. I was thinking, what kind of person am I to do that?" And he goes, "Now I'm actually realizing I'm a person whose survival brain is, really well attuned, and that was trying to help me survive. And I can probably forgive myself now that I know that." And so for me, a huge part of my work over the last number of years has been opening up conversation, opening up space for people to normalize, to maybe understand a little bit more about what's normal when we are experiencing adversity. but also to normalize it for themselves, to go, yeah, actually, I was responding that way because I'm a human being, and this is how humans are designed to respond. And when we open up those conversations, when we give people a little knowledge, but open up those conversations amongst groups and practitioners, it really transforms people's experience. And so I think for me, all the way through my work over the last kind of 25 years has been this through line of making safer space for people to maybe get new information, but also hear new stories, maybe say things that are a little more difficult. So whether that's in mediation, whether that's in traditional peace building, whether that's in kind of training people around trauma-informed and resiliency-informed practice, it's about opening up those spaces and conversations. And, that has really stuck with me over the last couple of years since that conversation about how much that can mean to people and how much transformation can take place when people are able to move into those spaces where they can get more information and maybe also share a little bit more about their own experience.
That's a fabulous learning, to recognize what's happening with yourself, to learn from it, to forgive yourself, so you can go forwards. Absolutely fabulous. Sarah, I know absolutely nothing about trauma-informed mediation.
Yeah.
It's a very embarrassing thing for me to admit to. So let's start with the basics here. What is trauma?
So trauma is, there's so many different definitions, but the one I like to use is that trauma is something that deeply impacts us and that often moves beyond our existing sort of self-care and support structures and creates that longer impact for us. People often have really helpful and quite sophisticated self-care routines, social support networks. I mean, we know how to look after ourselves when we're experiencing everyday stress. But trauma is often an event, an experience, a series of events or experiences that start to push past that. Okay, so it kind of breaks through what we normally do to support ourselves in difficult circumstances, and it starts to really create that longer lasting impact. And often we notice that in a couple of different areas. We may notice it physically, not sleeping, or changes in eating habits, or levels of anxiety in the body. We may notice that mentally, so we might get forgetful. We might, find it hard to kind of think straight or think strategically. A lot of us had that problem during COVID. I just can't focus. We may notice that relationally, so communication breakdowns, maybe clinging to people or pushing people away. We may notice that spiritually, where we have a different perception of faith or even our understanding of the world. How can people do this to each other? Who am I in all of this? And of course, emotionally, we have huge impacts as well and changes in our behavior. So often we start to notice this real disruption in the way that we're experiencing our life in one or more of those categories when something moves into that space of trauma.
And of course, we're lucky if we recognize that. If we don't, if we're still suffering from PTSD, and we're irrationally cross or combative, that's a very hard place to be. Do you come across that in your work?
I do. And, one of the things that really helped me, Mike, when I started looking into this more, into this kind of area of trauma-informed practice, was even something as simple as when we experience trauma, or we can also call it toxic stress, one of the very natural responses to that is to get paranoid. Okay, so we kind of get suspicious of the world, maybe the people around us. And we see this so much in conflict-affected communities and areas, not least Northern Ireland, where, we see it with groups, we see it with individuals, where people become quite suspicious of each other. And once we know that as a practitioner, that's actually just a really normal response to trauma, then we can start to address that in different ways. So when I'm working, for example, with organizations or even nations, I did some work in New Zealand recently around the anniversary of the Christchurch mosque attacks. Working with government agencies to say victims and survivors of very difficult experiences, traumatic experiences, often need three things. They need physical and psychological safety, they need acknowledgement, and they need information. And if we can start to provide those things, it can put people's minds at rest. So even something as simple as it's going to be really normal to experience a bit of paranoia if you've experienced trauma. How can we address that? By reassuring people, providing as much information as we can, acknowledging that that's something that may happen, and here's some ways you can support yourself. There are some really, kind of straightforward ways of beginning to support people who are experiencing some of those very natural and common responses to trauma.
And quite often, of course, the trauma the trauma that we see as mediators has been preceded by childhood trauma,
Yeah.
and that's where it gets really tricky. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that's the hard thing. As a mediator, as a peace builder, your job is not to go back into that space. You're not a clinician. You're not a therapist. You have to be so careful about not moving people into a space that you're not equipped to support them through. So I think we have to be really boundaried in our practice around that. But I think, often people may raise that themselves in the process. They start to talk about their background. And again, we need to hold those spaces really carefully. And so that's where the resiliency-informed practice comes in, helping people maybe manage some of the in-the-moment responses to things that are coming up for them without digging deeper into their past. But it can be really important, and I know we're venturing now into the area of trauma-informed practice, but it can be really important for us, if we're a mediator or we're a peace builder and we're setting up a mediation or a dialogue space, we need to be really careful to think ahead around where might trauma show up. So, if we're imagining that maybe some of the parties, for example, in a mediation are bringing some childhood trauma, we see ways in which maybe the current conflict that we might be helping to support with mediation might be bringing some of those things up for people. We need to anticipate that and how we can hold that space more safely for people, even before that mediation starts. So that's part of, I think, our expanded notion of what we can offer as mediators is anticipating where things might show up by way of trauma and creating those safer spaces.
I mean, I'm fascinated. We could go down that rabbit hole as well, but we won't. But instead, what I want to do is I want to look at the impact of trauma in conflict resolution. So to have you explain trauma-informed mediation, that would be very useful.
So you've got two great questions there. The first question is, where we see trauma show up or, in conflict resolution processes. And I think, we see it a lot without necessarily realizing what's happening. So in the past, many of us as mediators or peace builders, we're very good at reading a room. We can absolutely see when people are becoming agitated or distressed, but we haven't always known how to address that. Okay. So when we ask people to talk about very distressing circumstances and ones that might bring up previous distressing circumstances, it's quite normal actually for people to have pretty strong responses in the body. So whether that's a panic attack or a flashback or even dissociation where people feel disconnected from their body or their experience in that moment, those are some of the stronger responses, and those can definitely take place. But even shorter term responses where people in the moment, find their hearts are starting to race and their shoulders are getting tight and their back's up, as we say here in Northern Ireland, and you can see that happening. As a mediator, we haven't always had the information or the background to know, okay, maybe what's happening in this space right now is a trauma or a strong stress response. How do I deal with that? Okay. And what has happened in the past, I think, is sometimes we haven't always held that space as safely for people as possible as we might possibly have done, because we haven't really known. So you just kind of carry on with the mediation, carry on with the dialogue, you check on someone during the next break. Whereas now with trauma-informed practice, we will be getting the tools, those of us who've trained in this now have the tools to recognize, okay, something's happening here. How do we respond in the moment? And ultimately, my belief as a mediator and a peace builder is that not only will people be safer in those processes if we can know how to address them when these issues arise, but also we may end up seeing a real difference in, I hate to use the word success, but the outcomes of our mediations and dialogue processes, because when people become really distressed, when people are moving into fight, flight, or freeze mode, they're often either exiting the mediation. Somebody might go very, very quiet if they become frozen, if they move into freeze, that very normal survival response. If people move into fight or flight, that's when you see people throwing the verbal grenades, if you will. Sometimes a mediation or a dialogue goes off track very quickly. And sometimes that's because someone's moved into fight or flight and they kind of go, nope, not having that. This is all very instinctive, but maybe say something or do something that's really disruptive to the process. And all of a sudden, everything grounds to a halt. If we can pause before we get to that point, when we see someone becoming distressed, and do something to help them feel better in that moment, to feel more in control, to come back to themselves, they're feeling safer. we're getting to proceed with the mediation if they feel comfortable with that, and we're not getting that kind of large-scale interruption. But also as practitioners, we're experiencing more safety ourselves in that space, okay? Because when somebody really becomes very distressed in a mediation, or indeed when things start to fall apart quite quickly and it affects all the parties, it also affects us because we're humans in that space. And our nervous systems are in communication with all the nervous systems of everybody in that room. So when one person really becomes distressed, we all are going to feel it, including the mediator or the peace builder. So it ends up being something that's safer for us, safer for the parties, and ultimately, hopefully, more effective in the work we're doing when we can hold those spaces when trauma begins to emerge.
I'm not going to ask a really complex question here because we can't answer it in one. But what I'm feeling is this is all very new, and all very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
How much training is available in conflict-informed mediation?
Okay, well, I realize I didn't answer your second question. So I'm going to actually just directly address what trauma-informed mediation is, and then a little bit about kind of how we can start to move into that space.
Cool.
So trauma-informed mediation, very simply, is mediation that takes into account knowledge of very normal stress and trauma responses that people may have. So as mediators, it's about building our psychoeducation, if you will, around stress and trauma. So what's normal? How does it occur in the body? Biologically, what's happening when we're moving into fight or flight, for example. And knowing a little bit more about some of those maybe more intense in the moment trauma responses. So things like flashbacks or dissociation. So knowing a little bit more about what we might see, what are the signs that someone's maybe distressed and having a trauma response, and again, knowing why that might be occurring in their body. The second stage of trauma, or part of trauma-informed mediation, is then knowing what to do about it. And we're kind of moving into that space of resiliency-focused work or informed work as well. But, when we know then how to manage those situations better as a mediator, it means we don't have to kind of cross our fingers and hope for the best. It means we can pause, pause the mediation, look after the parties, do something that may be a little more constructive in that space before we move on. So it's knowing more about trauma, and it's knowing how to support people when trauma arises. In terms of how to get more skilled up as mediators or peace builders in this area, the exciting thing is this is really new territory. So we're hearing more about trauma-informed practice across a whole number of fields. So we're hearing it more in medicine. We're hearing more in education. We're hearing about it in humanitarian practice and peace building work and negotiation work. I wish we were hearing more about it in politics. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but but in a lot of these other areas, practitioners are starting to talk about, okay, how do we understand trauma more and anticipate how it might show up in our work, and then again, know how to address it when it does show up. So the exciting thing about this starting to move into the mediation space is we're in a really early stage of this conversation. So we're just starting to shape the conversation. And in Northern Ireland, Mediation Northern Ireland has been a big part of that by offering training for the first time in trauma-informed mediation. So I delivered a training with Mediation Northern Ireland for Mediation Northern Ireland in January and February and March of this year. And it was really fantastic because we gave it loads of time and space. So we did one day in January, totally focused on trauma-informed practice. So building up our psychosocial understanding of stress and trauma responses and what those look like. Day 2 in February was on resiliency-informed practice. So what are the well-being tools that we can intervene with when someone's distressed? How can we reframe and refocus our practice so that we're looking for opportunities to cultivate resiliency, to help parties in mediation really feel what they've accomplished and understand, kind of how strong they are, and to build that kind of post-traumatic growth, if you will, in the parties that we're working with. And then the third day was applying it to our practice. So it was a whole day of what does this mean for us as mediators? How do we start to shape our practice differently? How do we work together to continue this conversation and develop this conversation of trauma-informed mediation and resiliency-informed mediation? So we're really at the vanguard of this in Northern Ireland, within Mediation Northern Ireland, and we're joining little tiny early days conversations all over the world with people who are trying to explore this space in a new way. So it's very exciting to be at the forefront of this conversation.
It's so exciting. And part of my head has been looking back at past mediations where I haven't recognized what was going on, and that's so important. I'm absolutely delighted and excited, and just let me know when the next training is, because I want to be there.
And if I can say, Mike, I think you've touched on something so many of us feel, which is, particularly in the context of Northern Ireland, when we were doing peace building and mediation work in relationship to the troubles, to the conflict here, people were not trained as clinicians. We did not have training in counseling. We had almost zero training in trauma and what that looked like. And so many of us were figuring it out as we went. And people were trying their best to offer really safe spaces and to offer really supportive spaces. But, we were, in a sense, flying blind on some fronts, and so I think many of us as practitioners go, ooh, I wish I'd known that 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And people still did extraordinary work. It's just exciting to think about the fact that we might do even more helpful work in the future because we've built on this wonderful legacy of the work people have done here for so many years. And that work has informed where we are now, trying to understand trauma better and trying to respond to it more effectively.
We've talked a little bit about trauma-informed mediation, not nearly enough. There's so much more that we could talk about, and I'm so excited by it. But I'm also aware of the fact that we haven't spent enough time talking about resiliency-informed mediation. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, this is very, very new, I have to say. We may be the first ones using this term, really. And this work, again, to give credit to where credit's due, Elaine Miller-Karras and the Trauma Resource Institute, who created the community resiliency model, have really informed my thinking in this area. So often when we think about trauma, that takes up most of the conversation. People get pulled in that direction, and it's really important to understand more. But we forget the other side of the coin. So humans are designed for survival. We're designed to make it through very difficult experiences. But we also have this kind of inbuilt way of healing and coming back after. So, humans are inherently resilient. And when we can start to understand a little bit more about how the body functions in terms of stress response, but also healing and resiliency responses, then we can start to work with our bodies more to allow ourselves to kind of become more resilient over time. So if you will, kind of a practical resiliency. So we can start to work with the nervous system, which is the part of the body that moves us into fight, flight, or freeze. And that's often why we feel so agitated in our bodies when we're stressed or when we're experiencing trauma, the racing heart, the tight muscles, all those very clear physical indicators that all is not well. When we begin to have a little more knowledge about the nervous system and actually about the brain as well, the survival brain, how we respond in crisis circumstances, we can start to work with the brain and the nervous system to signal to say, actually, right now in this moment, I'm safe and I'm okay. I might not have been in the past. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but in this moment, all is well. And when we can find simple but effective ways to signal that to these important parts of our body, our emergency response systems, it allows us to feel more control in the moment. So there's a practical biological element of resiliency in my mind. But there's also this element of helping people tap into that natural awareness of their resiliency. So not just asking people about the trauma. So for example, when I'm working in a Ukrainian context, I don't say to people, tell me about all the ways you're suffering right now. Because as they do, what we pay attention to grows. If people talk about that, they're going to relive it in their body. But if I say to someone, this has been a tremendously difficult time for you, for your country, what's something that's kept you going? Have you felt your own internal strength during this time? If so, what's that looked like for you, for your family, for your community? And people, their answers are tremendously inspiring. People have ways that they've kept going. They have things that have helped them become stronger, but they often don't recognize those things. So helping people have that space to recognize their resiliency, to talk about it, is a really important part of resiliency-informed practice. And in a mediation standpoint, we can do that by building those spaces into a mediation, pausing to acknowledge what people have accomplished so far, inviting people to talk about how do you feel this is working, what's been helpful to you so far in our process. So even before we get to the end, helping people really recognize this is your process. You're the ones who are contributing to it. How does that feel? Does that help you feel stronger? And I think that changes the nature of the conversation in ways that can be really helpful to the individuals, to the parties involved in a mediation, but also to the final outcome of a mediation.
And I guess, we haven't done this in the past because we'd felt it was too trivial when in fact it was vital.
Absolutely.
How do we let people know how important it is?
I think we just have these conversations. I mean, that's the through line of all my work. We need to talk about it. We need to make space for it. Some of my colleagues and friends and families might say that this is my American way to bring it in and let's just talk about it. But there's huge freedom in just simply starting to have these conversations. It's amazing what people begin to do together once we have the conversation about something that's new and something that might be possible in our work. So the early days conversations at MNI around resiliency-focused mediation and what that might look like have been incredibly inspiring. And we're building that space together. And so I think that's the important thing is as mediators, how do we kind of just begin to open up this conversation around what would trauma-informed mediation look like? What would that change in our current practice? What would resiliency-focused mediation look like? How do we hold those things in balance and plan for integrating both pieces into our work as mediators? So it's a tremendously exciting time to be starting this conversation.
Sara, I've learned so much in this conversation. It's absolutely fabulous. I hope you've noticed the light bulb moments going off with me. But the important thing is that we recognize that we're at the start of a process that we can continue to learn from.
Yeah.
And it's certainly something I want to continue doing. Sadly, that brings us to the end of this conversation, this edition of the Resolution Room on trauma-informed mediation. Many thanks. I can't tell you how grateful I am to Sara Cook, conflict response specialist, for explaining how much we still have to learn and how exciting that is going to be. If you'd like to find out more about mediation, training and its uses, please contact Mediation Northern Ireland at www.mediationnorthernireland.org. Thanks for listening. We look forward to your company in the Resolution Room for the next edition of this podcast series.